September 15, 1987. Washington, D.C. Viktor Yasmann, 34 years old, a correspondent for TASS, the Soviet telegraph agency, entered the Washington Post building for his first day participating in a journalist exchange program. The program, part of broader cultural exchanges between the United States and Soviet Union during the late Cold War period, allowed Soviet journalists to observe American newsrooms and American journalists to visit Soviet media organizations. Viktor had worked for TASS for 8 years, reporting primarily on international affairs, with the careful attention to ideological correctness that Soviet journalism required. He had prepared himself for what he expected to see. Soviet journalism education taught that Western media, particularly American media, operated under capitalist control. The owners, wealthy industrialists and financiers, dictated editorial policy to serve their economic interests. Reporters who challenged this system faced termination. The appearance of press freedom was theater, a sophisticated form of control more insidious than Soviet methods, because it pretended to be free while actually serving ruling class interests. Viktor expected his observations to confirm these teachings. He would see how the capitalist system controlled information while claiming freedom. He would document the subtle mechanisms that ensured American journalists served power rather than truth. His report would expose Western hypocrisy and validate Soviet media practices. The Washington Post newsroom stretched before him, dozens of desks occupied by reporters working on stories. Phones rang constantly. Editors conferred with writers. The energy was palpable, chaotic in ways Soviet newsrooms never were. His guide, an American journalist assigned to show him the operations, led him to observe reporters at work. At one desk, a reporter was finishing a story about Reagan administration policy toward the Soviet Union. Viktor positioned himself to read over the reporter's shoulder, a habit from Soviet journalism where reviewing colleagues' work for ideological correctness was standard practice. The story was critical, not subtly critical, directly, explicitly critical of administration decisions. The reporter detailed what he characterized as policy failures, quoted unnamed administration officials expressing doubts about the approach, and concluded with analysis suggesting the policy was both ineffective and potentially counterproductive to American interests. Viktor watched as the reporter finished typing, made a few edits, and sent the story to his editor electronically. The editor read it quickly, made a few stylistic suggestions, sent it back for minor revisions. The reporter made the changes. The editor approved. The story moved to layout for the next day's edition. The entire process took approximately 30 minutes. Viktor waited for the additional review. For the political editor, who would check ideological content. For the management representative, who would ensure the story aligned with national interests. For the consultation with government officials to verify that publication wouldn't damage state policy. The additional review never came. The story was done. It would publish the next morning. Viktor couldn't contain his confusion. He asked his guide, speaking through the interpreter accompanying him, who checked this for anti-state content? Which official approved criticism of government policy? The American journalist looked at him with an expression Viktor couldn't quite interpret. Puzzlement. Maybe pity. No one, the journalist said. The First Amendment protects us from government interference. We can publish criticism of the government without approval. That's what press freedom means. Viktor stood silently, processing this information. It contradicted everything he had been taught about American media. If the government didn't control content, if owners didn't dictate political positions, if reporters could criticize policy without approval, then Western press freedom wasn't propaganda. It was real. That evening, Viktor sat in his hotel room and began writing notes that would never appear in his TASS reports. Notes about what he had actually observed rather than what he was supposed to report. His notes concluded with a sentence that captured his growing understanding. We have been told lies about American journalism. The propaganda machine isn't in Washington, it's in Moscow, and we are part of it. To understand the shock Viktor experienced, you need to understand the reality of Soviet journalism and the system within which Soviet reporters operated. Soviet media existed under complete state control. Pravda, the Communist Party's official newspaper, was the most prestigious publication. Izvestia, the government's official newspaper, ran second. TASS, the state news agency, provided content to all Soviet media and served as the primary source of international news. Television and radio were state monopolies. Every publication, every broadcast, every piece of journalism produced in the Soviet Union operated under party control and state censorship. The censorship process was formal and extensive. Glavlit, the main administration for literary and publishing affairs, was the official state censorship office. Every manuscript, every article, every broadcast script had to receive Glavlit approval before publication or broadcast. The censors reviewed content for ideological correctness, ensuring nothing contradicted party positions, criticized the Soviet system, revealed information the state wanted concealed, or questioned leadership decisions. Political content received especially intense scrutiny. Stories about domestic politics could only present the party line. International affairs had to follow the Ministry of Foreign Affairs positions exactly. Economic reporting had to emphasize socialist achievements and ignore failures. Cultural coverage had to promote socialist realism and condemn bourgeois art. Military affairs were particularly sensitive, with most defense information simply prohibited from publication regardless of how the journalist framed it. Beyond formal censorship, self-censorship was perhaps more powerful. Soviet journalists learned quickly what topics were acceptable and what subjects would create problems. Chernobyl disaster coverage in 1986 was heavily restricted. Afghan war casualties were not reported. Economic shortages couldn't be discussed honestly. Corruption within the party was forbidden territory. Journalists who wanted to maintain their positions and protect their families learned to avoid these subjects entirely. Why write a story that would never publish and might generate unwanted attention from the KGB? The career consequences for journalists who questioned the system were severe. Demotion was the mildest punishment, reassignment to less prestigious publications or positions. More serious cases resulted in termination, not just from a specific job, but from journalism entirely. Some journalists who persisted in questioning official narratives found themselves diagnosed with sluggish schizophrenia, a political diagnosis used to commit dissidents to psychiatric hospitals. The threat extended to families. A journalist's children might be denied university admission. Spouses might lose their positions. The pressure to conform was intense and personal. Journalism education reinforced the system. Journalism schools taught correct socialist reporting as a fundamental skill. Objectivity was presented as a bourgeois concept that served capitalist interests by pretending neutrality while actually supporting the ruling class. Soviet journalism, students learned, should be partisan, explicitly supporting the working class and the Communist Party that represented workers' interests. The goal wasn't to report facts objectively, but to advance socialist ideology through selective reporting and proper framing of events. Foreign correspondents faced additional controls. Soviet journalists stationed abroad, like Viktor Yasmann, when he worked overseas for TASS, had to file stories through Moscow. The stories were reviewed, edited, and often rewritten by editors and censors before publication. This ensured that even journalists observing foreign countries directly couldn't report what they actually saw if it contradicted official narratives. The KGB maintained representatives in foreign correspondent offices, monitoring journalists and ensuring loyalty. The irony of Pravda's name, meaning truth in Russian, wasn't lost on educated Soviets. The joke circulated that there was no truth in Pravda and no news in Izvestia, which meant news. The newspapers named Truth and News provided neither, instead, publishing state-approved propaganda carefully crafted to serve party interests. Most Soviet journalists understood they were producing propaganda rather than journalism in the Western sense. Some rationalized this as serving the state, believing that maintaining social order and advancing socialism justified the deception. Some genuinely believed in the system, convinced that Western press freedom was illusory and that Soviet methods were actually more honest by acknowledging their partisan nature. Others simply accepted the reality as unchangeable, focusing on career advancement and family welfare within the constraints they couldn't alter. When Soviet journalists were selected for exchange programs to visit American newsrooms, they arrived with clear expectations shaped by their training. They would observe how Wall Street controlled media content. They would see how reporters were told what to write, how criticism of capitalism was forbidden, how the appearance of diversity masked fundamental uniformity in service to ruling class interests. They would document the sophisticated control mechanisms that Western media used to maintain the illusion of freedom while actually serving power. What they encountered instead shattered these expectations completely. The First Amendment to the United States Constitution states, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances." Soviet journalists read this text as part of their preparation for exchange visits. They assumed it was aspirational rather than operational, a noble-sounding principle that didn't apply in practice. When they discovered it was enforced literally by courts, that government officials actually couldn't censor newspapers or punish journalists for criticism, the cognitive dissonance was profound. Newsroom visits to major publications revealed operations that had no Soviet equivalent. At the Washington Post, Soviet visitors observed reporters investigating government agencies, conducting hostile interviews with officials, and publishing findings that embarrassed administrations. The editors decided content based on news value and journalistic standards, not political considerations. No government representatives sat in editorial meetings. No censors reviewed stories before publication. The independence was absolute. The Washington Post's Watergate coverage became a frequent reference point in Soviet journalist accounts of their American experiences. In 1972 and 1973, two Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, investigated a break-in at Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate complex. Their reporting revealed connections to President Nixon's re-election campaign and eventually uncovered a pattern of illegal activities and cover-ups extending into the White House itself. The investigation forced President Nixon's resignation in August 1974, the only presidential resignation in American history. Soviet journalists hearing this story were stunned. Viktor Yasmann later wrote about his reaction. In the USSR, a reporter who investigated the General Secretary would disappear. His family would disappear. The investigation would never occur because everyone understood the consequences. American reporters investigated their president, exposed crimes, and forced his resignation. This wasn't just press freedom. This was press power that had no Soviet equivalent. The Pentagon Papers case provided another example that Soviet journalists found incomprehensible. In 1971, the New York Times obtained and began publishing classified documents detailing the history of American involvement in Vietnam. The documents revealed that multiple administrations had misled the public about war policy. The Nixon administration sought a court order preventing publication, arguing national security concerns. The case reached the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the New York Times, protecting the newspaper's right to publish the classified information despite government objections. Soviet journalists tried to imagine a comparable scenario in Moscow. The security services would have raided the newspaper before the first article published. The editors would face trial for treason. The reporters would be in prison. The documents would be seized. The newspaper might be shut down permanently. Yet in America, the Supreme Court, the highest judicial authority, sided with the newspaper against the government. The contrast revealed the fundamental difference between systems that claimed to value truth and systems that actually protected it. Investigative journalism as practiced in America had no Soviet counterpart. American reporters routinely investigated government agencies, military programs, corporate malfeasance, and political corruption. They published findings without seeking approval from the subjects of their investigations. They faced no censorship, no KGB interference, no career destruction for exposing inconvenient facts. The concept that journalism served as a check on power, rather than a tool of power, was foreign to Soviet experience. Editorial independence meant decisions about content, about what stories to pursue and how to present them, resided with editors and publishers rather than government officials. Owners of newspapers couldn't dictate political positions without violating professional ethics that journalists took seriously. While publishers influenced editorial policy on some issues, particularly those affecting their business interests, they couldn't simply order reporters to support or oppose government policies based on political preferences. The professional culture of American journalism maintained independence as a core value. White House press briefings demonstrated the adversarial relationship between press and government that shocked Soviet observers. American journalists asked hostile questions. They challenged official statements. They demanded clarification of contradictions. Press secretaries answered, deflected, or declined to comment, but they couldn't silence critical questions. Soviet briefings operated on completely different principles. Questions were pre-approved. Answers were scripted. The performance was choreographed cooperation rather than adversarial inquiry. Local newspapers throughout America exercised the same freedoms as major national publications. Small-town papers in communities of a few thousand people criticized local government officials, investigated local controversies, and published content that displeased powerful local interests, all protected by the same First Amendment that protected the New York Times and Washington Post. In the Soviet Union, local newspapers published only positive stories celebrating local socialist achievements, following the doctrine of socialist realism that required art and journalism to present idealized versions of Soviet life rather than critical analysis. Television news operated on competitive principles that Soviet journalists found bewildering. Multiple networks competed for viewers, reported different angles on the same stories, criticized each other's coverage, and all criticized government when they deemed it warranted. Soviet television consisted of a single state channel broadcasting uniform messages approved by authorities. The diversity of American television news, the competition, the different perspectives all existing simultaneously without central control, seemed chaotic to Soviet observers accustomed to planned, coordinated messaging. Ownership diversity in American media contributed to content diversity. Thousands of independently owned newspapers published across the country. Different owners had different political perspectives, different editorial priorities, different approaches to journalism. This created a marketplace of ideas with no central authority determining what could be published. The Soviet system had only state-owned media. Every publication answered ultimately to the Communist Party. Independent voices didn't exist because independent ownership was prohibited. Access to government officials followed patterns that Soviet journalists found remarkable. American reporters routinely interviewed government officials, often on background or off the record, with officials revealing sensitive information that they didn't want attributed to them personally, but wanted made public for various strategic reasons. The relationship between reporters and officials was transactional and sometimes adversarial, but it involved genuine information exchange rather than simple transmission of approved propaganda. All official Soviet statements were pre-approved propaganda, carefully crafted to advance party interests with no room for deviation or genuine revelation. The personal freedom American journalists enjoyed extended beyond professional practice to career choices. Reporters chose journalism as a career without state assignment. They could change employers, moving from newspaper to newspaper, from print to broadcast, based on personal preference and opportunities. They could specialize in any subject area, from sports to politics to culture. Soviet journalists were assigned positions by state authorities. They couldn't change employers without official permission. Career paths followed state planning rather than personal choice. Soviet journalists who spent weeks or months observing American media operations experienced profound reactions that challenged their fundamental understanding of journalism, media, and state power. Viktor Yasmann, whose initial experience at the Washington Post opened this story, spent 3 months observing American journalism in 1987. His testimony, recorded in interviews conducted after the Soviet collapse, described his transformation. "I realized I wasn't a journalist. I was a propaganda writer. American reporters did what we pretended to do. They investigated. They questioned. They exposed. We wrote what we were told to write and called it journalism. The comparison was devastating. Genrikh Borovik, a prominent Soviet journalist and war correspondent, visited multiple American newsrooms in 1986 as part of his research for a book about Soviet-American relations. Borovik was well-traveled, experienced, and sophisticated in ways many Soviet journalists weren't. He had seen Western countries before. He understood that Soviet propaganda contained exaggerations. But even Borovik found the reality of American press freedom shocking. He reported back to colleagues in Moscow, their press freedom is real. It's not subtle control. It's not illusion. They are actually free to investigate and publish. Our press freedom is the fiction. The pattern repeated across dozens of Soviet journalists who participated in exchange programs throughout the 1970s and 1980s. They arrived skeptical, assuming American press control operated through subtle mechanisms they would identify through careful observation. They looked for the hidden censors, the quiet editorial guidance that enforced conformity, the financial pressures that disciplined reporters who strayed too far from acceptable narratives. They found none of these things. The control mechanisms they sought didn't exist. American journalists were actually free in ways Soviet reporters had been taught was impossible. The cognitive dissonance was severe. Lifelong indoctrination taught that Western press freedom was a myth, that capitalism controlled media as effectively as communist parties controlled Soviet media, just using different methods. Direct observation contradicted this completely. The theoretical framework Soviet journalists used to understand media couldn't accommodate what they were seeing. Some resolved the dissonance by accepting that their education had been wrong, that Soviet media practices were worse than they had understood. Others compartmentalized, maintaining their official beliefs while privately acknowledging the observations that contradicted them. Some Soviet journalists never adapted. They completed their exchange programs, returned to Moscow, and continued working for state media as if nothing had changed. They wrote the required propaganda, followed the censorship requirements, and maintained their careers within the system. Perhaps they rationalized their observations as exceptional cases that didn't reflect broader patterns. Perhaps they simply chose career security over intellectual honesty. Or perhaps they genuinely couldn't abandon beliefs that had structured their entire adult lives. Others changed careers when opportunity presented itself. Several Soviet journalists who participated in exchange programs during the 1980s became independent reporters during the Glasnost period and after the Soviet collapse. They founded newspapers, worked for new independent publications, and applied the principles of actual journalism they had observed in America. Their transformation from propaganda writers to actual journalists traced directly to their experiences witnessing press freedom in practice. Personal transformations extended beyond career choices to worldviews and political beliefs. Seeing free press operations changed how Soviet journalists understood the relationship between state and society, between power and truth, between control and freedom. Many became advocates for democracy and openness during the late 1980s, using their positions to push for reforms within the limited space Glasnost created. Their advocacy was informed by direct observation of how free societies functioned, not just theoretical arguments about democracy. Some journalists requested asylum or sought ways to extend their stays in America. The formal exchange programs had fixed durations, but some participants found justifications for remaining longer, taking additional assignments, or arranging follow-up visits. The opportunity to operate as actual journalists rather than propaganda writers was compelling enough that some chose exile over returning to the Soviet system. The fundamental differences between Soviet and American media systems reflected deeper political, economic, and cultural divergences that made the systems incompatible. The political systems required different media approaches. American democracy, however imperfectly it functioned, required informed citizens capable of making meaningful choices about leadership and policy. Free press served this requirement by providing information, investigating wrongdoing, and enabling public debate. The The Soviet totalitarian system required controlled information to maintain power. Free press posed an existential threat because it would expose the gap between propaganda and reality, undermining the party's legitimacy. Constitutional protection in America prevented government censorship through explicit legal barriers enforced by courts. The First Amendment created a framework where government officials who attempted to censor newspapers faced legal defeat. No Soviet equivalent existed. The Soviet constitution included provisions about press freedom, but these were understood as describing the freedom to support socialism, not the freedom to criticize the state. The legal framework reinforced rather than limited state control. Economic independence enabled American press freedom through private funding models. Newspapers derived revenue from advertising and subscriptions, not government subsidies. This economic independence provided protection against political pressure. Publishers could afford to oppose government policies because their revenue didn't depend on government approval. Soviet media was entirely state-funded. The government paid salaries, provided facilities, supplied equipment, and controlled distribution. The economic dependence created total vulnerability to political pressure. Cultural tradition mattered more than Soviet analysts wanted to acknowledge. American press freedom traced to founding principles. The First Amendment was ratified in 1791, part of the original Bill of Rights. More than 2 centuries of tradition, legal precedent, and cultural expectation created powerful barriers against government control. Soviet media had always been controlled. From the Bolshevik Revolution, through Stalin's terror, through post-Stalin periods, state control of information was constant. There was no tradition of independence to appeal to, no historical precedent to cite, no cultural memory of free press to recover. Soviet leadership feared truth about system failures. The gap between propaganda claims and actual conditions was enormous. Claims about economic prosperity contradicted shortages and poverty. Claims about workers' paradise contradicted poor living conditions and lack of freedom. Claims about socialist superiority contradicted obvious Western advantages in standard of living, technology, and opportunity. Free press would expose these contradictions, revealing to Soviet citizens the reality their leadership worked desperately to conceal. Censorship was necessary because truth was too dangerous to permit. The legacy of Soviet journalists' encounters with American press freedom extended well beyond individual transformations to influence broader historical developments. Exchange journalists returned to Moscow with stories about what they had witnessed. These accounts circulated among Soviet intelligentsia, the educated class of professionals, academics, and cultural figures who discussed ideas the broader population didn't access. The stories contributed to growing awareness that Western societies functioned differently than propaganda portrayed, that some Soviet claims about the West were simply false, and that alternative models of media and governance existed and worked effectively. Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost policy, announced in 1987 and gradually implemented thereafter, was partially inspired by the recognition that information control was becoming unsustainable. Western radio broadcasts penetrated Soviet borders. Travelers returned with accounts contradicting official narratives. The gap between propaganda and reality was widening to the point where maintaining the fiction required ever more effort. Accounts from Soviet journalists who had witnessed Western press freedom contributed to the understanding that controlled media was a weakness rather than a strength, that the Soviet system's inability to tolerate truth revealed fundamental problems rather than effective control. The post-Soviet period saw brief experimentation with actual press freedom in Russia during the 1990s. Newspapers operated with minimal censorship. Investigative journalism emerged. Critical coverage of government was possible. Many of the journalists who led this transformation had participated in exchange programs during the Soviet period, or had learned from colleagues who had witnessed Western journalism. They understood what free press looked like and attempted to create it in Russia. The current Russian government has reimposed many controls reminiscent of Soviet-era censorship. Independent media faces harassment, legal pressure, and violence against journalists. Many Russian reporters operate in exile, publishing from abroad because they cannot work safely in Russia. The regression demonstrates that political systems that fear truth will always seek to control information. that press freedom requires constant defense, and that gains can be reversed when authoritarian leadership consolidates power. The American journalists who participated in reverse exchanges, visiting Soviet newsrooms and observing Soviet journalism practices, gained understanding that improved their reporting about the Soviet Union. They saw firsthand how censorship functioned, how propaganda was produced, how Soviet journalism served state power rather than truth. This understanding enabled more accurate analysis of Soviet information operations and more sophisticated reporting about how the Soviet system actually functioned, rather than how it claimed to function. September 15, 1987. Viktor Yasmann left the Washington Post building after his first day observing American journalism. His expectations had been clear. He would witness sophisticated capitalist control of media, confirming what Soviet journalism education had taught him about Western press. What he witnessed instead was reporters investigating government without fear, editors making decisions based on news value rather than political considerations, and a legal framework that protected journalists from state interference. He witnessed actual press freedom, not the theoretical kind that existed in constitutional texts, but never in practice, but real freedom exercised daily by reporters who understood it as their professional right and responsibility. The experience shattered Viktor's understanding of journalism, media, and the relationship between press and power. Everything he had been taught about American media control was backwards. The Americans weren't controlled by subtle capitalist mechanisms. They were genuinely free to investigate, criticize, and publish. The propaganda machine wasn't in Washington, it was in Moscow, and Viktor had been part of it for 8 years without fully understanding what he was participating in. Soviet journalists arrived at American newsrooms expecting to confirm their indoctrination about capitalist control of media. They discovered instead that the indoctrination itself was the control mechanism, that Soviet media operated as propaganda while claiming to serve truth, and that genuine press freedom existed in the society they had been taught was enslaved by capital. The irony was profound. Soviet journalists worked for publications named Truth and News that provided neither. American journalists worked for privately owned newspapers that nonetheless pursued truth with remarkable tenacity and published news that frequently embarrassed or opposed the government and powerful interests. The system that claimed to serve truth produced propaganda. The system accused of serving capital produced actual journalism. The encounters between Soviet and American journalists during the Cold War revealed more than differences in media systems. They revealed fundamental differences in how societies organized the relationship between power and truth, between state and citizen, between control and freedom. Soviet society required controlled information to maintain political order. American society, whatever its many flaws and contradictions, had built legal and cultural structures that protected independent journalism as essential to democratic function. Soviet journalists who witnessed American press freedom returned to Moscow changed. Some became advocates for reform, others compartmentalized their observations. But none could entirely unsee what they had witnessed. They had seen journalism as it was supposed to function, reporters as they were supposed to operate, and press freedom as it was supposed to exist. And they understood, more clearly than Soviet citizens who never traveled, exactly what their society lacked and exactly what their leadership feared. The propaganda machine was in Moscow. American journalists were actually free, and Soviet journalists who discovered this truth faced a choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable reality. Some chose reality and changed their lives accordingly. Others chose comfort and continued their careers as propaganda writers. But all of them knew, after witnessing American journalism, exactly what they were choosing and exactly what they were sacrificing. That knowledge, once acquired, could never be completely suppressed. It contributed to the growing awareness among Soviet intellectuals that their system was built on falsehoods, that alternatives existed and functioned effectively, and that the future might require fundamental changes rather than continued pretense. The free press that Soviet journalists witnessed in America wasn't just a different way of producing news. It was evidence of a different way of organizing society, one where truth was valued more than control, where citizens were trusted with information rather than shielded from it, and where journalism served the public rather than the state. Soviet journalists expected to see a capitalist propaganda machine. They discovered the propaganda machine was in Moscow, and that discovery, repeated across dozens of journalists over more than a decade of exchanges, contributed to the eventual recognition that the Soviet system couldn't sustain itself indefinitely on lies when truth was available to anyone willing to look.